My name's Ross Harley. I'm the Dean of UNSW's Art and Design School, and it's great for us to be meeting here on Gadigal country, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to thank the Gadigal people for their custodianship of the land and the waters upon which we meet, and to extend that respect to any First Nations people here today with us for this symposium on archives in the digital age. This symposium is part of an ARC linkage project between Macquarie University, UNSW and Kaldor Public Art Projects. And later on we're going to hear about the project itself, the Digital Archive. Today is an opportunity for all of us to think about the relationship between the archive, digitization and the experience that audiences bring to those materials. We've got a great lineup of speakers today, and the format is really quite simple. We have 3 talks in the first part of the afternoon, followed by a short break, and then 3 more talks, followed by a panel discussion. This is a really great theatre, and I'd like to thank the Art Gallery of New South Wales for hosting us here. It's an opportunity for all of us to be engaged in the conversation, and our presentations are really part of the way that we'd like to approach the dialogue between you, the audience, and we, the presenters. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, John Potts. John Potts is he is the lead chief investigator on this project. In fact, we have all of the investigators on this project speaking today, and we have Dr. Scott East, who is one of our chief investigators in the audience today, and we'll all be available to comment and continue the discussion. John is Professor of Media at Macquarie University, and he's the author of many books, including The New Time and Space, A History of Charisma, Ideas in Time, and a classic, Culture and Technology, with Andrew Murphy from back in the day. And would you all join with me in welcoming John Potts?
Okay, as Ross said, this project results from an ARC linkage grant which was awarded last year with the title of Making the Temporary Permanent, Digitising the Kaldor Public Art Projects Archive. The ARC project grant is based at Macquarie University, with chief investigators from Macquarie being Professor Nicole Anderson, who'll be speaking next, and myself. And 2 other chief investigators on the project are Ross, that you know, and Scott East, who's here as well. This team from UNSW. This team has worked intensively with the staff at Kaldor Public Art Projects, most notably the archive collection curator Alice Desmond, who'll be speaking after me. Also with the firm Government Records Repository, which was the company who digitised the complete contents of the archive, as we'll describe, and also the website designer Peter Heery of the company InZen to create this new digital archive. The principal aim of the project for the ARC has been to make the unique archive of Kaldor Public Art Projects available to researchers in Australia and overseas, and to the public through the creation of a digital database and interactive website. We can officially announce that this aim has been met and the project has been a success, and it's a bit of a sigh of relief for all concerned, because today, November 20, 2019, at 5 p.m. or a little later, the Kaldor Public Art Project's digital archive will be formally launched by John Kaldor himself, who's here. So we'll be launching it this afternoon. This is a sneak peek at the front page of the Kaldor Public Archive. It isn't quite officially live yet. It'll be live soon after 5 o'clock. I was very keen to launch the new digital archive at the Art Gallery of New South Wales now, during the Kaldor Art Project's 50-year exhibition, hence the decision to have it now late November. I suspect at times that my colleagues on the project, especially Alice, Peter, and the repository scanning team may have questioned the wisdom of that, as the enormity of the process of digitising an enormous archive and shaping it into a searchable database became apparent. It was probably a much bigger project than we envisaged when we started. The sheer volume of scanning and digitising was staggering, as was the volume of technical decisions needed to construct the searchable database, largely on the run, as Alice, Peter, and other members of the team were working feverishly to solve various technical decisions. Alice will describe some of that process and some of those details in her presentation next. I simply wish at this stage to pay tribute and thank all those who contributed to this successful project, which we'll publicly launch this afternoon. Now, Kaldor Public Art Projects, as we know, have staged public art projects in Australia since 1969. In that year, Christo and Jean-Claude's Rap Coast at Sydney's Little Bay was the first large-scale public art project presented anywhere in the world, and the first time an international contemporary artist had created a major new work in Australia. Over a period of 50 years, Kaldor Public Art Projects has staged 35 temporary site-specific projects around Australia, all free to the public by Australian and international artists, supported by extensive public and educational programs for each project. In 2016, Barangal Daya, staged at Sydney's Royal Botanic Gardens by the Indigenous artist Jonathan Jones, transcended disciplines to become a major cultural festival, incorporating an extensive public program of lectures, talk, and an Indigenous dance event. Kaldor Public Art Projects was the first organisation of its type in the world. Others have followed, yet KPAP, for short, was, in the words of Anthony Bond, former curator of contemporary art gallery art here, way ahead of the field. The immense success of the first KPAP project in 1969, its impact in the international art world, and the excitement it generated in the Australian public encouraged John Kaldor to embark on a series of public art projects in Australia spanning these 5 decades. The organisation has staged temporary public art projects by many leading international artists, all whose work is included in the archive. These include Marina Abramovich, Bill Viola, Namjoon Pike, Sol LeWitt, Richard Long, Jeff Koons, John Baldessari, Michael Landy, and Thomas Demand. The projects have all been temporary works, yet they've left a cultural permanence in the Australian landscape. Our aim is for the digitising of the Kaldor archives to cement this cultural legacy, making the permanent temporary. Strong public interest in the projects has been measured in visitor figures. Project 24 by Michael Landy, for example, attracted 170,000 visitors to Sydney CBD. Marina Abramovich attracted 32,000 for hers, and the Jonathan Jones work about 90,000 visitors in 2016. International visitor numbers to the website are also high, indicating a strong international interest in Kaldor projects past, present and future. Now, over this 50-year period, Kaldor Public Art Projects has accumulated an extensive archive of materials associated with the 35 public art projects it has staged. This archive includes many things, such as plans, models, correspondence between leading international artists and the founding director, John Kaldor, negotiations with public authorities over sites, documentation of logistics and production processes, planning of public and education programs, as well as reviews and criticism of projects and other correspondence. This vast archive, containing documentation of the process of proposing and realising such large-scale public art projects, was not digitised and therefore largely unavailable to the public until today. Requests have previously been made by researchers to access this archive, but this access has been limited due to the storage of the archive within the office space in Rozelle, Sydney. One example of a project based on the archive was the PhD thesis by Rebecca Coates called The Rise of the Private Art Foundation, Kaldor Art Projects, published at University of Melbourne in 2013, and based on research conducted in the archive, the physical archive. Her published journal article, John Kaldor's Early Art Projects and the NGV, also drew on archive material and gives a taste of the kind of research outputs that can now be generated once researchers can now gain easy access to the Kaldor Digital Archive. The transformation of the physical archive into a public repository as a digital archive provides a new educational resource which will make the archive materials available to all researchers, national and international, and will thus generate new forms of knowledge about public art. What is an archive? The popular image of an archive is probably something like this. Rows of files and documents stacked in cardboard boxes, locked away in a windowless, airless and lifeless cavern-like space, either underground or otherwise out of the way, hidden at the back of offices, away from the actions and decisions of the present day. The archive for most people is an unappealing proposition. It's dusty, musty and fusty. The records of the past sadly distant from the dynamism of the present. However, I suggest this is not an accurate depiction of what an archive really is. Recent research has indeed noted the increasing significance of archives in contemporary culture. The archive, as art historian and curator Charles Merriweather has noted in this book, is distinct from a collection or library and is much more than a cupboard storing files in boxes. Rather, the archive constitutes a repository or ordered system of documents and records, both verbal and visual, that is the foundation from which history is written. Archive theory has in fact developed a considerable literature across a range of disciplines, including media studies, cultural studies, history, museum studies, art history, literary studies, and philosophy. Theorists of the archive have often drawn on Michel Foucault's investigation of the conditions of knowledge in Archaeology of Knowledge and other works. The archive has therefore been critically appraised as a form of regulation of knowledge within a broader regime of power and discourse. As Charles Merriweather remarks, the archive from this theoretical perspective governs what is said or is unsaid, recorded or unrecorded, as a repository of knowledge. Jacques Derrida has also turned his attention to archive fever, as Nicole Anderson will probably discuss in her presentation today. The status of the archive shifts enormously when it becomes a digital entity. Previously secluded and available only to the very few, once digitised and placed online, the archive becomes a public resource available to all. Our collaborative project has digitised the Kaldor Public Art Projects archive, making it widely available to researchers and to the public as an online resource. The contents of the archive are now searchable on a dedicated website, creating a valuable store of public knowledge on contemporary art and cultural history. The digitised archive constitutes a trove of materials for researchers in art history, contemporary art and social history, for secondary and tertiary education, and for members of the general public. So, what exactly is in the Kaldor archive? Over 50 years and covering 35 projects, we would expect this to be an extensive collection of documents and other material. And we'd be right. The physical archive comprises over 18,000 A4 pages. That was a conservative estimate before we started, and Alice will probably tell you it was more than that, which gives you an idea of the extent of the scanning process. This was collected in some 77 archive boxes. This is the physical archive out at Rozelle. The documents within these archive boxes contain correspondence between the artists and John Kaldor, detailing planning and logistics of new Kaldor projects. Other documents concern negotiations with public organisations to obtain permission to stage a temporary artwork in public space. Apart from paper documents, the archive contains a range of what can only be called miscellany, which is probably very specific to this archive. These comprise, and Alice could fill in some more details, at least 124 posters, maps, plans at various stages of development, charts, artworks, and getting into real miscellany, t-shirts, and etc. I'm not entirely sure what etc. was. Alice could probably fill that in. These objects of miscellany provided a particular challenge, as you'd expect, in the digitising process, requiring the need for either specialist scanning or photography. We were very lucky that the government records repository, who scanned a lot of it, had the most amazing scanning flatbed equipment I've ever seen when we went out to visit their offices, which gave us great confidence that they could pretty much scan everything, and what couldn't be fit on a scanner was turned into a digital photograph. Those objects of miscellany provided a particular challenge in the digitising process, requiring the need for specialist scanning and photography. The final digitised database, after a long and at times difficult scanning process, has been constructed as a searchable website, accessible from today at there. But don't do it yet, until 5 o'clock, when it's officially launched. The homepage of the Digital Archive looks like this, as we saw before, with a selection of images or documents from each of the 35 projects running across the top. There's provision for on the website for a user to search under a specific project, the project button up the top, or to conduct an advanced search for particular records or archive items. Here's an example of how the new Digital Archive could work. I have a PhD student, and this is true, I'm not making it up, writing a thesis on walking art in Australia, a fascinating topic. She has a particular interest, as you'd expect, in researching the influential walking art project conducted by Richard Long in Australia in 1977. And she's always asking me about it. How can I find out more about that, the planning of it, the concept behind it. Before today, she would need to write to Kaldor Public Art Projects, explain her research interest, somehow find the time to get to Rozelle, if her requests were approved, then rifle through the archive boxes in search of relevant documents, in the limited amount of time probably allowed. Today, instead, she can go to this website, click the project slide, which is there, and look for the Richard Long project, which I think is number 7. Is that right? Project 7 from 1977. Then click that and see some of the correspondence which is there, including a postcard from Richard Long and a further list. Oh, there was another slide there. I missed it. There's another slide of the documents that are available in under Project 7. This includes correspondence between Richard Long and John Kaldor dating back to March 1976, in which details of the proposed walking art work project are discussed. All this can now be accessed in seconds from anywhere in the world. So through clicking through project and various links, you can go to all the records relating to that project, including some of the pre-planning, where some of the concept behind the work may be articulated. The benefits of the Digital Archive for researchers, artists and members of the public are readily apparent. Recent theoretical investigations have turned to the contemporary status of the archive as a repository of knowledge now constructed with the means of digital technology and networked information technology. The subdiscipline within media studies known as media archaeology in fact starts with the archive, as has been observed. A number of theorists have rethought the archive in the context of networking and the digitisation of knowledge, where the databases become the central form of knowledge, as detailed in Lev Manovich's book, The Language of New Media. Another theorist called Eivind Rozak has described digitised archives as archives in motion, due to their dynamic, changing form, in which knowledge is continually added or transformed. The Digital Archive is reconceptualized as a dynamic entity or operative memory. In his book, Digital Memory in the Archive, which I think is the most extensive and far-reaching analysis of the properties of the Digital Archive, the German media theorist Wolfgang Ernst considers the transformation of the archive as a form of knowledge based within the internet. The Internet Archive, Ernst claims, is modelled more like a library than a traditional archive. which is true. It's indexed and searchable and focuses on the transmission of knowledge as much as its storage. Ernst also examines the cultural politics of the network archive in recent archive theory. He weighs the transparency and public availability of the digital archive against the protocols informing the structuring of the archive as a digital form and the collection of user data that may then be put to further use. The media theorist Jussi Parikka noted in 2012 the need to rigorously rethink the concept and practices of the archive in the age of audio-visual and software media, but further remarked that this research is in its early stages. He calls for more research on the digital or dynamic networked archives within media archaeology and digital humanities. Our project, that is part of whose fruition you see today, is a contribution to that further research. The project constitutes a case study in the digitisation of an archive and its rendering as a networked entity. The project will also generate new forms of knowledge, not just from researchers, but by artists who may access the archive, and also new means of theorising the contemporary archive. We hope to put together a book of articles and essays based on the presentation today to be published next year. So we'll add to the theoretical study of the digital archive as a system of knowledge. The archive is a form of artificial memory, like books, computer files, or writing itself. The digital archive, however, is a new form of memory, operative, dynamic, a living archive. The digital archive is a database that can be continuously drawn on in the present to generate new works. This is particularly evident in music, where the musical database of sampled songs or compositions is the musical archival base for new digital works. In instances such as this one, the archive is a digital database of music and sounds, waiting to be creatively transformed into a new work. This process, which was once called appropriation back in the 80s and 90s, now tends to be termed transformative. And in music, it's based on the potential of the digital sampler that music people will know, we can be proud of, derives from the Australian invention, the Fairlight CMI, or computer music instrument, of 1979, pretty much the first digital sampler, to compile an ever-expanding library of digital sounds. Transformative works build on found objects, and those found objects are found in the digital archive, also known as a database. Transformative works abound in internet culture, from the fan fiction works that transform established text online to memes and ironic appropriation of found material, all based on material found within the internet. The Kaldor Digital Archive is in many respects a living archive. It will be incorporated into the Kaldor host website, ensuring continuous public visibility of the archive and previous projects. This will encourage artists, curators, and researchers to revisit archival works, perhaps reconsidering them or even transforming them. The current 50 Years Kaldor exhibition upstairs in the gallery is itself a vast archival work. Curator Michael Landy has created a huge new artwork, in a sense, comprised of the 35 previous projects. In this way, the Kaldor public art projects will stay alive through the archive in the present and into the future. Just a list of references for anyone who's interested. Otherwise, thank you.
Thanks very much, John. So we have a few moments for questions while we set up for our next speaker. And I think, Antonio, you have the microphone over there. We are recording today, so if you could please wait for the microphone to ask your questions. So quick questions from the audience, remembering that we're going to have an opportunity at the end of the day for all of our presenters to have a Q&A for quite a period of time.
Ross, there's one there.
Hi, Mandy Crook from Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences. Will the archive be added to with future projects?
Yes. So I should have added that as one of the aspects of it being a living archive that will be continually added as the projects keep going, yes. So it's not a finite or closed thing.
There's another question just up here, and we'll have to pass the mic.
Yes, hello. Thank you for that. I was just wondering what permissions were sought from any of the artists that have been involved over the 50 years.
That was one of the processes. Alice might talk about that in her next one, but part of the responsibility of the Kaldor Public Art Projects team as the industry partner on the research grant was to secure permissions, so it was an extensive process. I believe I was partly assisted by the fact that the exhibition here in the gallery required permissions as well. And in fact, some of the exhibition is curated by Michael Landy involves some of the things that we were digitising at the same time. So permissions were granted for that, and then for all the work to be done on to be released and publicised on the website. You're quite right to point out that that is it was a very important part of the process, because the digital archive is in effect publicising everything on it, including the correspondence, whereas before it's all hidden away in 77 boxes. Suddenly it's a public entity. So permissions have been sought and attained, but Alice might be able to give more information on that.
So our next speaker is Alice Desmond, and as you've already heard, Alice is one of the key reasons why this project even exists. She's been working tirelessly on this archive since the inception of the project, in her formal role as the archive collections curator at Kaldor Public Art Projects. Before working at Kaldor, she's worked at the National Gallery of Australia and the National Museum of Australia and at the Sydney Review of Books. And today she's going to talk a little bit about the process of putting this archive together, this living archive, into a web database form. Please join with me in welcoming Alice.
Thanks, Ross. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. So, as Ross has said, I'm the archive collection curator at Kaldor Public Art Projects. And as you're all abundantly aware, this year marks the 50th anniversary of Kaldor Public Art Projects, and we are celebrating with an array of programming that commemorates and reactivates the 35 art projects that have taken place since Christo and Jean-Claude wrapped the coastline at Little Bay in 1969, and that indeed continue today in and around the exhibition and 35th project, Making Art Public. The Kaldor archives have been at the heart of our celebrations, and I'm excited that from today we get to share the thousands of letters, documents, candid photos, ephemera, plans, sketches and other artworks that have been gathered over 50 years and have never before been released to the public. So since I joined the Kaldor team last November, I've had the extraordinary opportunity to both manage the digitisation of the archives and also to facilitate access to these archives to curators, researchers, designers, filmmakers, students and artists. So as a collection curator, I have to adapt to see the archives from multiple perspectives, depending on the task at hand. So over the past year, I've worked on developing a database and creating registration practices for our collection. So at times it can feel like I know the data about the collection better than the actual objects themselves. But also in my role, it means seeing the creative potential for a long-forgotten facts or knowing exactly where to find the right press clipping or letter that will help somebody verify their research. And I'm lucky that working with Kaldor also means that I get to see the multitude ways that artists take inspiration from the archive and how they use it as a catalyst to develop exhilarating, unexpected creative works. The exciting thing about creating a digital archive website is that it combines these different elements of curating a collection. It draws the seemingly mundanity of collection data in order to present the collection in a new way that invites everyone to access it in whichever way inspires them. So this year I've had the enormous pleasure of working with Michael Landy, who of course curated the spectacular exhibition Making Art Public, which is on display here at the gallery. And he used the archive as his raw materials. It's evident as soon as you enter the exhibition that Michael's approach to creating a new public art experience based on the previous 50 years of art projects went far beyond just mining the archives. As Michael describes it, instead of reproducing the experience of witnessing each of the 34 Kaldor public art projects, this exhibition takes form in what is left behind, the remnants that are stored and archived. My role in making art public is to animate these remnants by treating them as physical material to sculpt with. So taking this idea of archives as a medium to work with, rather than merely as objects to display, the possibilities are endless. And here are some of the sketches that Michael produced while working in the archives. So over several trips to Sydney over the past 2 years, Michael immersed himself in the archives and created innovative, imaginative responses to each of the projects, offering numerous reinventions for each of the preceding 34. And now you can, and from this afternoon, you can browse these proposals online on our archive website. By working with Michael as he developed concepts for the exhibition, I became attuned to the visual potential of items, and I also became alert to the way that seemingly mundane bits of administrative detail could spark inspiration. The exhibition looks beyond a conventional display of frames on the wall and objects in vitrines, and there are relatively few original archive objects actually on display in the exhibition. Having access to resources created through the digitisation project meant that we didn't have to worry about putting barriers between viewers and objects. We didn't have to use frames when we were working with facsimiles. And doing things like creating facsimiles from digital files meant we could display both sides of a letter at once and hide, Christo's private address. But more importantly, having these digital resources enabled us to use the archives to it enabled the archives to be reimagined in unexpected scale and contexts. Each of the archive boxes in the exhibition recreates the archive or the memory of the projects in a totally different way. Many of the boxes respond to features of the archives without presenting or reproducing them. Much of this is about evoking visceral, emotional, psychological, embodied responses. And in this way, Michael has invited us to see things differently, rather than simply presenting the archive. Conversations and storytelling were an essential part of the development of the concepts for the exhibition. Michael spent many hours discussing the projects with John and the team, and these insights were invaluable for my own understanding of what's in the archive, and more importantly, what isn't and cannot be part of the archive. While the intimacy, trust and fellowship that has been nurtured between various collaborators over the past 50 years is evident in parts of the archive, there really isn't a substitute for hearing directly and candidly from the people who were involved. It is this idea of conversations, candour and oral history that have been at the forefront of our Living Archives project, where we have engaged with people who experience projects firsthand. This project was initiated by Monique Leslie Watkins from our team, who has worked with our colleague Michael Waite to gather stories, photos and objects that animate our archives with vivid memories and personal connections. Our Living Archives community has been activated in our public programming, in study sessions and story swaps, as well as being recorded on our Living Archives blog. The artist Alicia Frankovich worked from and beyond our archive to discover and recruit people who had worked behind the scenes on projects for her large-scale choreography, The Work, which was performed here at the gallery over 2 weekends in September. Another commissioned artist, Agatha Goth-Snape, created the work Lion's Honey, which is performed for the duration of the exhibition and responds at a conceptual level to the history of the projects. In this work, the artist explores the complex dynamics of philanthropy, commissioning, and performing creative labour in public settings that run through all the Kaldor projects. As an artist commissioned for the anniversary, Agatha's work examines not just the history of the projects, but her own position in this legacy. The Kaldor studio has also been a site to interrogate ideas from past projects. Lucas Eileen and the Rizzeria are now in residence in the studio, producing a weekly newspaper that engages, sometimes critically, with Kaldor public art projects and their continuing impact on cultural life in Australia. And if you go along to the studio today, you can write a letter to the editor and contribute to the next issue. We've had plenty of other visitors to the archives this year. Filmmaker Samantha Lang visited the archives to research and source content for the documentary It All Started with a Stale Sandwich, which looked back at our projects over the last 50 years and the creation of the current exhibition. The film premiered at the Sydney Film Festival this year, and a shorter version is available to stream now on iView. Designer Mark Gowing and editor Genevieve O'Callaghan have worked with our team to create a comprehensive and conceptually innovative publication that records 50 years of Kaldor projects, including the current exhibition. This book will be available early next year. So, moving back to the digitisation project, So while all these different projects were happening and were using the archives in different ways, we still needed to digitise the entire material archive for this ARC project. The documents that John had retained for decades and that form the core of what we now know as the Kaldor Public Art Project's archive were brought together as research materials for the 40th anniversary catalogue, which was produced in 2009, edited by Sophie Forbat, our artistic program manager. Additional materials were gathered from collaborating venues, past photographers and other sources. In the years that followed, the archive expanded rapidly to accommodate more materials, both physical and digital, as new projects developed and more items from past projects were sourced. Over the last 10 years, the material archive was sorted, categorised and placed into mylar sleeves and archival boxes. An archivist position was created and was filled by Venetia Miller, then Inika Dane before me. Finding aids were written and white gloves were procured. No object that seemed important was thrown away, and everyone was asked to make sure that their important emails and documents were saved and given to the archivist, with varying degrees of compliance. So the next steps, of course, would be to digitise the collection and share it online. And I want to make the very important point that digitisation isn't just about creating digital images. When publishing a cultural collection on a website, it's absolutely crucial that each image file has its own unique identifier, so the sort of accession numbering that a museum or gallery might use, and that the image files are linked back to the data that explains just what that file is. So for most collections, this just means making sure that the image file is linked to the catalogue record on the collection database. And this record would usually already be populated with information about who made it, what it is, when it's from, that sort of thing. But in our case, when I started at Kaldor a year ago, we actually didn't have a collection database or a system of numbering or identifying the individual items in the collection. Finding aids existed as Word documents, but the level of detail varied from project to project. So the digitisation project wasn't just about scanning and photographing the collection. The crucial first step was to come up with a strategy about how to create and manage the overwhelming amount of data that is required to establish a collection website. So I felt the main priority in terms of getting the archive digitised and available online was to create a collection database so the information could be recorded and then the relevant parts could be pushed to web for public access. After considering various options, including creating a custom website or purchasing software such as Vernon, Emu or FileMaker Pro, we consulted and we decided to work with Collective Access, which is an open source collection management database. As well as being free, Collective Access offers the benefits of having a huge range of functionality based on international museum and archive standards. So it was better than starting from scratch, and it's going to provide us with plenty of scope to expand the way we use it into the future. A downside, however, is that free open source software doesn't necessarily come with the same level of documentation and support as a proprietary option does, and features that can be utilised may not have actually been thoroughly tried and tested by other users first, as we have discovered setting up our site. But one of the benefits is that it's customisable, so we did actually get to adapt it for our own context. For example, we decided that the ISADG, or General International Standard Archival Description, seemed like the best cataloguing framework to adopt for our collection. Since we didn't have one in use already, we kind of had to start somewhere. But since the terminology of this standard wouldn't be obvious to most visitors to the website, and importantly, it wasn't a language known to our team, we customised the terminology so it would correspond to how we actually think about and work with the archives. So looking now to some snippets from the website. So the arrangement of the digital records online matches the arrangement of the actual physical materials in the archive. So first of all, we've created records for each project, and these records link together all of the boxes and folders that actually exist in the physical archive. So that's a sort of conceptual container for all of the bits and pieces from the archive that relate to a project. The next sort of records we created are containers, and these records represent the sort of physical holder, like a box or a folder that exists in the archive. Then narrowing down from there, we have sections, and the section records include digital assets for all of the physical materials from a section of a folder. So we've got archive folders and they're divided based on what the content is inside them. So these section records on the website are where most of the pages and material are. So in this example, you would start with the project record and click through to the container, then click through to the section. And then you can see all these artist sketches by Namjoon Paik in the very same order that they appear when you access our actual archives in person. So this method of arranging the files is important for us because we have a really small team and the focus of our work is usually about working directly with audiences and artists to create new experiences. So collection documentation isn't really an expertise that's assumed in the work we do at Kaldor Public Art Projects. So having a website set up that actually relates to how we physically have things has been important. However, the archive website also has additional entry points for discovering materials. So users can browse by tag data, including names of people and organisations and item types and project phases that the materials belong to. So the focus for this stage of the project has been to digitise the material archives for every project since 1969, including the current project Making Art Public. In terms of the actual digitisation of the material in our archive, as John said, we considered different providers and selected to work with the New South Wales State Archives and Records Authority / Government Records Repository, based in Kingswood, Western Sydney, who have world-class facilities for digitising cultural objects. Their team, led by Thomas von Schomburg, worked with us to devise a process that allowed items to be embedded with metadata that could map the newly created image files with the collective access database, in theory. This was possible due to the dedicated efforts of my colleague Eliza Ormsby, archive assistant, who worked meticulously and tirelessly to catalogue the collection, to record metadata, and to create countless records in the database. And as John has already acknowledged, our developer Peter Heary has been an incredible collaborator whose constant enthusiasm and unwavering patience has made the digitisation and website a reality. Thanks are also due to Robin Stern, our Kaldor IT consultant, whose technical expertise and help to set up the site has been essential. So all of our digitised files are uploaded to the database now, and a huge array of these records are available on the website. However, we have had to withhold some records from public release. This is mostly for correspondence and administration for projects from the year 2000 onwards. Unfortunately, emails, which of course are the main form of correspondence now, tend to be riddled with private details that we need to be careful about publishing. A single printed out page from an email might have 10 different people's private addresses, like private email addresses on it. So we have to be mindful of how we use that information. But we do invite researchers to visit our archives in person, and we are also able to give electronic access to these restricted items on request because these resources, as I said, are already uploaded in the back end of our database. So now that we're going live, we'll continue to update the site with additional content, including digital-born images, videos, and other resources. As I said, this time last year, we just had finding aids created in Microsoft Word. So cleaning up the data a bit and adding new contextual links will be an ongoing task that we're really equipped to meet now that we've got this amazing website. But determining what's going to be useful for your research based on how it's described in a database is only a very limited way to engage with a collection. Working with our archives at Kaldor Public Art Projects is a hands-on experience, where visitors are welcome to flick through the projects, pull things out of boxes, and have a chat with the people who actually made these projects happen. And now that I've seen the diverse ways that people do engage with our archive collection, and find creative potential in the themes and ideas that are sparked by, but not explicit in the archives, I've come to realise that there is never going to be a perfect way to arrange these items on a website anyway. The important thing is just to give access. So looking forward, another step is to make the archive more accessible to educational audiences by making visible the concepts, ideas and curriculum links that relate to the projects, but are not necessarily obvious from considering something in the archive as a physical object. A further possibility may also be to include a presence for our Living Archives project, Stories and Objects. And I also hope that we can explore ways of incorporating items from other collections on the site. There's a wealth of materials out there that give insight into the creation and presentation of Kaldor projects in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the National Gallery of Australia, the ABC Archives, to name just a few. Digitising an archive during a period where that very archive is being used in so many different ways and places, both physically and digitally, is an unusual proposition, and it certainly has been challenging to achieve what we have. But the great thing about digitising our archive and launching our new archive website as part of the 50th anniversary program is that we aren't simply publishing a list of things that happen to sit on a shelf at the back of the office and saying, look what we've got. The launch of this website sits as part of this year's artistic program, where we've witnessed artists looking to and beyond our archive in ways that are playful, challenging, insightful and provocative, to create new experiences that invite the public to participate. Kaldor public art projects are always about involving the public as participants, not just viewers. So we are delighted to hand over our archives and hope you enjoy exploring.
Thanks very much for that, Alice. So while we're getting ready for our next speaker, we've got time for a couple of questions. We've got one over here, Antonia, just in the middle.
Alice, thank you for a really fascinating talk. Can you tell me, did you refer to, or were there precedents that you referred to when you were thinking about the Kaldor archive?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. One really interesting example is the New Museum's archive, because they look beyond objects and have things, like there's a really strong focus on people and also on public programming as part of the archive. They also use collective access as their database. So, being able to see that and what they can achieve. As I said, one of the reasons for adopting an open source museum standard website rather than building one from scratch is that, in years to come we can look into all those different avenues for exploration. Because, another thing I didn't mention was this year we also had Project 34, Assad Raz's absorption. So while people were using the archive, we were also having a rapidly expanding archive around us.
There's another question just down the front. Louise.
Thanks, Alice. Look, I just wanted to ask you about the stuff you've had to restrict. Because that's kind of where the dirt hits the road often, isn't it? Where you really have to think hard. So I was interested to hear more.
For sure. As John sort of alluded to as well, some of the parts of uploading the PDFs to the website took a bit longer than we thought. And it's not to stop people from looking. It's part of the reason we've been able to have permission to publish so much online is those personal relationships that have been nurtured for such a long period. So we're not sort of saying, we can never publish these things. It's just we need to be respectful of the relationships with artists and to sort of carefully read through everything and make sure things are appropriate before they go online. But everything from Project 1, 1969, through to Vanessa Beecroft in 1999, that's all online, so you can see the sort of development and lead up to the projects there. So it's not to say it'll never come online, it's just, it's something to be carefully thought about. Is that kind of...
So just to follow up a little bit, so all of the work that's been digitised and is in the collection, not all of it is public facing, some of it is just in the archive but not available for viewing. What's the process for researchers or for people who are interested to come and have a look at that material? Because part of the idea of the archive is to create this living database, which then encourages people to explore more.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that we've done is the container records are still visible, so you can see that there's another folder. Even if you can't see the contents of that folder, we've got the list of what the sections are within it, so that's one way that it's available. We also have our email address listed on the website, so people are invited to contact us and we can facilitate online access. There's ability in the website to set up user accounts for people, but we haven't made that available as a sort of blanket option for anyone to just log in.
So our last presenter before we take a break is Nicole Anderson. Nicole is Professor of Cultural Studies at Macquarie University with John Potts, and is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the journal entitled Derrida Today, published by Edinburgh University Press. And she's currently working on a book for Routledge called Culture, which explores the intersection between science, art, and culture, and she's one of the chief investigators of our ARC project. Nicole's going to ask us to think a little bit differently about the archive and to consider the ways in which the archive is about forthcoming memories as much as it is about memory of the past. So please join with me in welcoming Nicole Anderson.
Thank you, Ross. John mentioned that I was going to talk about archive fever as partly a Derrida scholar who applies philosophy to art. I'm not, but my paper is very much a philosophical paper in the sense that it thinks about a whole range of ways to think about the archive in a philosophical context. I will try and work in archive fever on the spot. So both in the private or public sphere, and there is never a clear distinction between the two, everything is an archive. Our homes are full of archives. The photos we choose to put in albums or objects we choose to display from our holidays, the gifts from friends that we decide to keep or not, interactive in function too. The furniture we buy is an archive of our aesthetic taste for our use and the use of visitors we allow into our homes. These memories of past events, in particular in the form of photos or art objects, the ones we choose or select to display, are voices from the past that always come to anticipate, haunt, or occupy our own memories and identities, building the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are as individuals. Likewise, there is also the public archives of art galleries and museums that attempt to preserve the representations of our cultural beliefs and values, historical trends, and artistic discourses. These are memories of our cultural past that come to haunt our future. The archive, then, is our prosthetic, individual and cultural memories and identities. Yes, you may be thinking, this is obvious. The archive is that which preserves the past for posterity, for future generations, for our cultural heritage. At least that is the dream of archiving, the dream of the archive. It is what the archive is for, after all. But with the enormous and unprecedented advances over the past couple of centuries, in the past couple of decades, in the technical possibilities of archivization, it is becoming harder and harder not to indulge in this dream of an archive that will become so effective, so performative, that it will be more or less total or absolute, capturing everything purely, without adulteration, and becoming transcendental, so to speak, that is, existing always beyond time and place and unchanging. This dream is today being fed and encouraged by the extraordinary powers of the archive in the digital age, an archive that includes sounds and images, and today already tastes, touches, and smells. Furthermore, it is nourished by the fact that the virtual archive has been freed of so many of the constraints of time and space, as Alice has just been telling us, allowing it to be located no longer in the special collection rooms of libraries or museums and art galleries or at Roselle, but in some off-site server or even more nebulously in the cloud. This is what the whole digitising of the John Kaldor art project is about in many ways, digitising and making the works widely accessible on a global scale to everyone. But this dream of an absolute memory, an absolute archive, in the form of digitisation or otherwise, is still precisely a dream. Because if it was truly absolute, truly transcending of time, space and place, it would spell the end of an archive, destroy any restricted and recognisable concept of the archive by breaking one of the unimpeachable laws of the archive, the law of its finitude. An archive that would be total would be no archive at all, I would argue. Why? Because for reasons both contingent and necessary, one cannot keep or save everything, as Alice has just been explaining to us. And this is because even a digital archive, where, say, everything in that archive is presented and uploaded, it is still nonetheless curated. And that means works are not just presented, but represented, interpreted, read or viewed in certain ways by both the curator and you, the audience. Any act of selecting what will be put in the archive, and thus any curatorial work, and any reading or interpretation of that work is, I want to argue, or in fact Derrida argues, Derrida is a French philosopher, is always already a violence. Because in selecting, in reading, one always has to neglect something else. Another viewpoint, an object or a text or an art, and so on. Violent selectivity or violent representation is the act of archiving, and consequently the archive itself becomes, as always, a political question, a political event. In other words, the archive and its law of finitude means that, in fact, one cannot save or select everything, and this becomes a political condition, as some people and not others are given the authority to choose what is to be selected and what not, what kept and what not, how it is to be classified and how not, where the archives are to be located and where not. There is another reason why an archive that would be total or absolute or transcendental wouldn't be no archive at all. And this is not just about the act of selection or presentation that makes the archive, even the digital archive, possible. Rather, it's about the fact that the very structure of any archive is subject to local and global cultural interpretations and conditions determined by time, place, and space. And therefore, every archive, as an event in itself, is inherently structured by a paradoxical process. And I just want to explain this paradoxical process. On the one hand, the archive is an attempt to protect, save, or indemnify a unique work or a singular event. The archive would therefore be that which is orientated towards the protection, safeguarding, and indemnification of this unique past or experience of the past, this irreplaceable and unrepeatable work or body of work. On the other hand, in order for this unique and irreplaceable work, either in art or photos or text, etc., to be saved, protected, or indemnified, it must be inscribed in a medium that will make it readable in future. For example, the medium of a marble, stone, wood, canvas and paint, paper and ink, paper and light, and so on. In other words, the text or the work of art must become legible, readable, repeatable, not only for the one who has created, written, or painted it, but for others who will come to view it, read it, or listen to it. In principle, if not in fact, long after the creator is gone. The archive, or what is archived, must offer itself as the unique work that it is to future iterations or repetitions or representations, interpretations or readings. It is the medium itself, whether tablet, papyrus, paper, canvas, hard drive, or today, tablet again, that makes possible the repetition of what has already happened, that is in the past, and could have already been predicted, but also that which will not have yet arrived, the future. It is the haunting of past and future that means that culture can never be fixed and absolute, but is always dynamic, responsive, and affecting. So in a nutshell, this is then the paradox of the archive. In order to protect and save the archive, that is the past, it must be open to the future events of reading and thus interpretation, which then alter the past event and thus alters the archive itself. Archiving is no protection against the change of the artwork or object that occurs in the act of reading or viewing and thus interpretation. The archive then is as much about the future as it is about the past. The future always already haunts the past and vice versa. The irony is that in order to preserve the past through the archive, one kind of has to kill the past by allowing it to be displayed in the present or the future, which then create the opportunities for the past to be killed or changed by those future readings. In this sense, the creator of works that are archived puts him or herself into the hands of the other, the curator, the archivist, the audience who reads, interprets, views. And this in turn is a survival, a living on, but never in the way we want or expect. Therefore, despite digitisation and its alleged dream of permanence and transcendentality, the archive and the digital archive is finite, contingent, and thus precarious, just like our identities, just like our lives. Again, ironically, the life or survival of an archive, of the creator, artist, writer, or even owner of the archive, like John Kaldor, or even us as we archive our lives in various ways, always in fact begins beyond one's lifetime, or beyond oneself, as we are interpreted and remembered at the hands of others. To put it another way, the archive is at the same time both a chance and a threat. A chance of survival of the past, and at the very same time a threat of extinction of that past. This is what happens always in the archiving process. It is what happens to us always as individuals. The archive is a prosthetic haunting of life in death and death in life. But let me not end with death, but with offering the hope that comes with archiving despite this paradox. If the archive is haunted by the past and the future, and if this future changes the past, changes the archive, so that any one true meaning of that archive is difficult, if this is the paradox of the archive, if this dream of the archive so to accurately record and preserve the past is precisely just a dream, then why archive at all? What the archive actually does, apart from preserving and protecting, I think, is far more interesting and important. What it does is open our imagination to understanding the diversity of the worlds the archive entails. It gives us a fleeting glimpse and understanding of the thought, the world of the other, no matter how transient, precarious, interpretable. And in particular, public art archives can help us experience the different perspectives of the planet we share with each other. And one of its greatest strengths is the ability to expand scientific facts, archival collections, works and data into effective and immersive engagement. It represents, performs and enlivens, and it affects and effects who we are, ultimately attuning ourselves to the wealth of the diversity that makes our planet so exciting and complex, bears the potential to change our conceptions of others. Understanding and appreciating the importance of differing perspectives can provide us with the essential conceptual tools we need for a better future on this planet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicole. We have time for a couple of questions before we move to our first break.
Hi, thanks, Nicole.
So, Nicole, maybe we'll get you back up on the mic. And if you could use the mic as well, just because we're recording. Thank you.
Hi, Nicole.
For posterity, in fact.
Brilliant as always, thank you. I just want to sort of, ask you, do you think the act of archiving is a political act? Is the process attuned to politics, both public and private?
Yeah, thank you. I do think it is a political act, even if it's with a small p. I think, in some sense, everything's political, and I think that politics is bound up with an ethics. So, and it's not always conscious, right? So, if you think about, Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, would say, what's an important question to ask around that is, who is determining what? It's the who that determines, right? So who is selecting? Where do those who's come from, right? And there's cultural and political implications to that. So, for example, I would say, here's an example. You could say that somebody might be from a certain background, or may not be from an Indigenous background, for example, or somebody who's educated as opposed to somebody who's not, who may have certain kind of privileges, who then gets to choose certain kinds of things, and therefore then gets to determine how that culture is in fact enacted or affected, or the dominant meanings of a certain kind of culture. So so I think that it's important to be mindful, because that in itself is a politics in it.
There's another question just over here. I might give you this mic.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Is there an archive fever now? It feels like, some people have been interested in archiving for a long time, but it feels like many people in the scholarly world, in the artistic world, are now seeing the archive as a place for, renewal, as I was talking about, for creative opportunity. Is that different, and why now?
Okay, so let me just go back to the archive. I didn't actually mention it in the paper, but it was there, in fact, because the talk is informed by Derrida's work, and particularly by archive fever. And Derrida would say that there is this dream of being able to, the actual dream of having an absolute archive is kind of a fever, right? In a sense, it's a cultural fever of trying to be able to preserve everything. But I think what Derrida would say is that, well, we can't, precisely because what Alice talked about and John talked about, we have to select, and there are reasons for that selection. But the fever of wanting to do so is a way of preserving our lives, and not just for our culture heritage, but for ourselves individually. So it's the dream of being able to be immortal, in a sense.
So just to follow up and push you a little bit more on that, Nicole. So I love the way that you talk about the stone tablet and then the digital tablet. What's the difference? What's the difference between the archive then and now?
I think that the digitising technology is the difference. I think it is a technology. In fact, our thumb is exactly. Yeah. The thumb is a technology, right? I think it's really about the accessibility and how many people get access to that. So the really positive thing about any technology these days is the way in which it can be globally accessed, as opposed to, say, a tablet in that time. Although we don't know, that tablet may have been accessed by an entire culture at that time, right? But it has the potential for, I think, a wider dissemination of viewing, of interpreting, of engaging.
Stephen.
Just a comment to, I think, is it Richard Pullman? Yeah. Every museum is an archive. And basically, the reason that we're concerned now why there is suddenly an archive fever is that we've hit a point where the media, the carriers for the works, are no longer easily maintainable. So, for example, I'm heavily involved in the digitising of the history of video art in Australia, for the simple reason that videotapes are all in the process of disintegrating. And so if we don't do it, then we have no art history. And I think that's the real point, is that we want to maintain an art history, whether it's Titian and Renaissance painting, or whether it's contemporary video art and stuff like that.
Great comment, Stephen. No, I think that wasn't really a question, but did you want to make a comment? It's actually probably a great way to segue to our break, because I think after the break, we're going to continue that thought, particularly I'm thinking of Katrina's presentation, which really touches on this. So we might just hold that thought. I think this has been a great provocation for all of us to think about for the next 15 or 20 minutes. Can you all join with me in thanking our first three speakers?